very, very warm welcome to today's session. Firstly, I hope all of you are keeping safe during these very uncertain times. We have a very interesting session planned today. We are in a stage right now, all of us have gone through different stages of the pandemic, and we are in a stage of reopening. Regionally, we've seen public and private sector workers heading back to offices. But at the same time, remote working is still continuing, and it looks like it's here to stay for the longer term. Now, one of the main problems that remote working poses is cybersecurity. Now, when you have a very distributed workforce, understanding how people access the network, understanding the devices they use, having any sort of control becomes harder. Now, in this kind of a situation, do organizations have control over the protocols that employees are following? What kind of vulnerabilities do employees pose? So to understand more on all of this, we are joined today by Nikki Cosgrove. She's a cybersecurity strategist at Proofpoint. And we also have with us Emile Abou Saleh. He's the regional leader for the Middle East, Turkey, and Africa at Proofpoint. Now, before we begin the session, just a quick reminder of the format and facilities. I'm sure all of you have seen the Q&A option here. Feel free to post any questions you have during the session. And if they're very relevant, then we'll take it on during the session itself. We also have time for a brief Q&A at the end. So you have an option to virtually raise your hand. So if you do that during the Q&A, we'll unmute you and we can take the question live. So with that, without taking up too much of your time, I'm going to pass it over to Emile.
Thank you, Arti. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Organizations worldwide are facing a fast evolving threat landscape, and those in the Middle East are no exception. The cyber threat landscape in UAE is rapidly evolving, with cyber criminals increasingly targeting people rather than infrastructure. In fact, as per the survey, we have seen that more than 80% of the surveyed companies suffered at least one cyber attack in 2019. When our people come under attack, they become our defense. We cannot expect them to saddle this enormous responsibility without first equipping them with the knowledge to do so. This means raising awareness. According to Verizon's data breach report, the human error accounted for more than 22% of all data breaches. We have to remember that you're not preparing your employees to pass a test. In fact, you are empowering them to protect your organizations from significant harm. Your training program must be reflecting this, and they should be ready for that. Before we start, I would like to give a brief overview about the survey. Proofpoint commissioned the survey of 150 chief security officers and chief information security officers. The survey was done in March 2020. The survey was conducted by research firm Census White on behalf of Proofpoint. The study explored three key areas: frequencies of cyber attacks, challenges to implementing cyber strategies, employees, and organizational preparedness. As per the survey results, we have seen that more than 2/3 of the UAE organizations are expecting more than 10% cybersecurity budget increase in the next 3 years. That's interesting. Let's hear more about the study from my colleague, Nikki.
Thanks, Emile, and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this discussion. We definitely want to make sure that this is, insightful, relevant to you. So if you have any questions at all, if there's anything that you want us to touch on or explain a little bit further, please ask those questions in the Q&A, and Emile and myself will try to address it as we go on. So as introduced, my name is Nikki Cosgrove. I'm responsible for cybersecurity strategy here in Proofpoint for our international markets. And as part of that role, what I do is regularly speak to our customers, regularly speak to CISOs in the industry to understand what are the challenges that you're all facing? What are the obstacles that you're trying to address, the attacks, the threats that you're trying to overcome to raise the defenses of your organization, to ultimately reduce the impact and the likelihood of the risks targeting your businesses. And so it was really interesting for me to dig into the survey results to look specifically in the UAE, what are the challenges that you're facing? And actually there's a lot of consistency between the discussions and insight that we have globally and in the rest of the world, and some of the trends that we're seeing in the UAE. But there are also some quite clear differences, and I think some clear areas where we can start to fill some of the gaps that we've identified in the survey. So first of all, the first question that we asked in the survey was, did your organization suffer a cyber attack in 2019? And, as to be expected, 82% of the survey respondents, of the CISOs that we surveyed, said that yes, they suffered at least one cyber attack in 2019. I think the interesting thing here as well is that 51% suffered multiple attacks over 2019. What we're starting to see in the threat landscape is, yes, increasingly businesses are getting attacked, but actually the targeting is increasing as well. And that's why cyber criminals will send maybe one attack, two attacks, three attacks, just a handful of attacks to an organization because they've done their research, right? They know who they're going after. They know what assets they're going after. They know what people they want to target and the people that are more likely to interact with their attacks. And that's why we see 31% yes, 31% said yes, just one attack. And we expect that number to grow over the rest of the year and into the next year and over the next 5 years as criminals become much more targeted. So I mentioned that we want this to be really interactive. We want to make sure that this is relevant to you. So we have a number of poll questions that we're going to send to you just to find out your thoughts and if you agree with some of the data from the survey that we sent out. So our first poll question is taking that next step further. It's digging in. If you're under attack, what do you see as the biggest cyber threats to your organization in the next 6 to 12 months? Is it cloud account compromise? Is it denial of service attacks? Do you see phishing is still a problem to your business? Or is it that insider threat that Emile started to allude to? What are the biggest threats that your organization expects to face over the next 6 to 12 months? Now, while you're thinking about that and filling in the results, this is what the CISOs in the survey that we did had to say. Account compromise. Account compromise, credential phishing, credential theft are increasing. 28% of the CISOs that we surveyed said that account compromise is the leading method of cyber attack. A further 20% said that credential phishing is really what they're seeing, where criminals are going after the usernames and the passwords of the users within the organization. As more and more of us move to the cloud, as we're leveraging web applications, again, because our users are remote, they're using their own personal devices potentially, they're trying to access corporate infrastructure through Office 365, G Suite. We're increasingly moving sensitive intellectual property to the cloud and cloud applications. We're finding that criminals are going after that data. Why hack the network if that network is now at Microsoft? Why hack the network if we've outsourced our data center? We no longer have a network as such for the criminal to hack. We're seeing that the criminals are finding it a lot easier to trick our employees into giving up their usernames and passwords, their credentials, instead of hacking that network. So let's reveal the poll answers. What do you all think? What are the top threats that you're all facing? And 70% of you said phishing. 70% of you say phishing is the #1 problem, followed by cloud account compromise, and then the insider threat. So we're actually going to come onto the insider threat discussion in a minute. But it's interesting that you all say phishing because actually credential theft is being delivered as an attack via phishing emails. The criminals are pretending to be, Office 365. They're pretending to be an Excel document online. And in fact, we're going to see what that looks like in the coming slides. Now, this is interesting because we wanted to give you some visibility into what is going on from a global perspective and how the UAE compares to some of the trends that we're seeing globally. And this is data from the latest Verizon data breach report. So they published this report maybe a couple of weeks ago. And within the data breach report, Verizon analyzes data breaches, confirmed data breaches, to understand exactly why these breaches happened. What were some of the causes to lead to a breach in data? And again, correlating with the survey that we did, that use of stolen credentials, the use of cloud credentials, the fact that we're all migrating to the cloud accounted for 37% of all of the data breaches that they analyzed, of the 3,950 data breaches. They also found that phishing, interestingly, again, continues to cause those breaches. Criminals are sending email phishing to steal credentials, to trick our users into clicking links, to trick our users into opening attachments that they think, might be legitimate. They enable the macros, they download malware, and then the criminals are quietly monitoring. They've installed a stealer, they're quietly monitoring all of the communications that's taking place right now on that device, all of the things that are being typed on that device to steal those credentials. The survey, the Verizon Data Breach Report, also found that 22% of all breaches globally were because of human error. That's somebody making a mistake. That's somebody doing something wrong. That's somebody sending data that they shouldn't send to the wrong person, which in the eyes of the regulators is still a data breach. And again, we'll come into human error in a minute. Now, credential phishing. This definitely correlates with what we're seeing at Proofpoint. So according to Proofpoint's own research, 58% of organizations have experienced at least one targeted password attack. That's where the criminals are sending something like this. It's an email that looks like it's coming from Office 365. It says, hey, there's a document that's been shared with you. All I need you to do is click on this link so that you can access the Excel sheet online. Of course, the user clicks on the link. They get sent to a website that looks like it's Office 365 in an Excel document. They put in their username and password so that they can access that document. But what they're actually doing is sending those credentials directly to the criminal because it's a spoofed website that makes it look like it's coming from Microsoft. 85% of organizations globally have been targeted with at least one of these attacks. What's worse, 45% of organizations have had at least one breach of credentials. So we surveyed our threat data, we surveyed a number of organizations out there, we did some threat intelligence and threat gathering, and we found that 45% of organizations that we analyzed had at least one compromised account. And once the criminals are in, they have the keys to your crown jewels. They have the keys to your data, your intellectual property, your customer data. They have the ability then to send internal phishing from an email that's legitimate. So it's increasingly difficult for your organization to detect if this is a phishing email because it's actually coming from a legitimate email account. Now, focusing on human error, the third attack vector. 55% of the CISOs that we surveyed believe the human error and that lack of security awareness is a risk factor to the organization. 55% of CISOs believe that the employees that they have within the business are a risk factor to the organization, that they expose the business to cybersecurity risk. Now, I think it's very easy to say that the human is the weakest link, that the human makes mistakes, that the human is the reason why we keep getting compromised. But I think there's something else going on here. The fact that half of the CISOs that we surveyed believe that their people expose risk shows that we as security professionals have more work to do. But do you agree? Our next poll asks, 55% of organizations believe that human error and a lack of security training are the biggest risk factors to our organization. Do you agree with this? Is this what you see within your business? It's certainly what Verizon saw, again, in the Verizon Data Breach Report that they analyzed this year. In 2019, 22% of the breaches that were analyzed were caused because somebody did something wrong. Somebody attached a database to an email and sent it to the wrong person. Somebody clicked on a link, compromised their credentials, and those credentials were then used to steal data. Somebody opened an email, enabled a macro within a phishing email, downloaded malware onto their device, and allowed the criminals to monitor what was going on their device. 22% of breaches were because of human error, somebody doing something wrong. Now, I am going to read what Verizon said in the report, because I think it rings so true. They said, the only attack type that is consistently increasing year on year in frequency is error. People can and frequently do make mistakes. People can and frequently do make mistakes. So now they're saying that errors are equal, that they are more common than phishing emails. They're more common than malware. That actually human error caused more breaches than malware attacks. So this is definitely something that we need to pay attention to. This is something that we need to realize is potentially exposing our businesses to risk. And we're going to touch on what we can do to overcome these human challenges in a little bit. But let's look at the results. Do you agree? Do your users pose, oh my gosh, 100% of you agree that yes, human error and that lack of security training are the biggest risk factors to your organization. And I think, again, it really correlates with what we saw in the UAE study that we did of CISOs within the region. It correlates with the Verizon data breach report and the analysis that we're seeing here. And it correlates with the fact that human error is the only attack vector that is increasing, if you look at this chart, year on year. All right, and now looking at the impact. So within the survey, we asked, how did cyber attacks affect your business? And we allowed the survey respondents to pick multiple choices. And within the results, we have two things that are very close. Financial loss. 29% of the survey results showed, or the CISOs that we surveyed, mentioned that financial loss is the biggest impact to their businesses. This was closely followed by data breaches. 28% of the survey respondents said that data breaches is the biggest impact to their organization. And then that decrease in customer base, that lack of trust, is an impact to the organization as well. But I think it's interesting because if you combine financial loss, you look at data breaches, you look at that decrease in customer base, all of that has financial impact. So you hear a lot of CISOs saying, you know, I'm trying to make security more relevant to the business. I'm trying to get our business stakeholders to care. I need the board to care and give me budgets. But actually, this demonstrates that security and cybersecurity risks have a direct correlation to the bottom line of our businesses. If we have a breach, we lose trust. If we have a breach, we have to remediate. If we lose customer data, we potentially have to pay fines, regulatory fines, because that data was breached. So there is a direct impact to the business bottom line because of cybersecurity risks. And I think increasingly what this is demonstrating is that we need to start speaking the language of the business. We need to stop talking about, you know, how much spam and how much malware was targeted at the organization. We need to stop talking about denial of service and using language that the board doesn't understand. We need to use their business terms. We need to talk about people. We need to talk about the impact, the risks. We need to talk about the controls that we're implementing and the effectiveness of those controls in minimizing the risk and impact. We need to tie it back to preventing that financial loss. So I'm going to pause here. Emile, are there any questions at all from the audience?
I'm answering those as we go, so no questions so far.
Excellent. Now, looking at one attack type that is directly linked to financial loss, and that is business email compromise. Business email compromise or email fraud or email phishing, whatever you call it, is 100% social engineering. And here's an example, a recent example of a business email compromise attack that's leveraging the latest challenges that we're facing with coronavirus and COVID-19. It's spoofing the identity of an executive, and it's saying, hey, I need you to do something urgently for me. 3 people have tested positive for corona in the area. I can't go out. Please reply to this email. Don't call me, just reply, and I will tell you what I need you to do. This is pure social engineering. There's no malware to sandbox. There's no URL to check. There's no payload. There are no macros. It's purely trying to leverage that human need to please, that human need to do our jobs, obviously, that human need to respond to our executives and our bosses and our leaders and do what we're told ultimately. And that's leading to a huge financial loss. Because what we're seeing is that criminals are sending business email compromise attacks, pretending to be our executives. They pretend to be our business partners. They pretend to be our suppliers. They'll send an email with an invoice saying, hey, here's the latest invoice. I need you to pay this quickly so that we can fulfill, this shipment that we need to send to you. Or it might be an executive saying, hey, I need you to send me all of our employee database because we're going through our review periods right now, and I'm working with our human resources team to do that analysis. And people are sending money and data directly to the criminal. Once again, the criminals don't have to hack anything. They don't have to look for any vulnerabilities. All they do is send a simple email requesting somebody to do something, and that somebody ultimately does do it.
Nikki, talking about the risks and the latest threat landscape, we have a question here. What are our key risks today? What emerging threats should we be more concerned about during these times?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think it really correlates with the survey results. And in fact, this is really the last slide to top off all of the results and all of the threats that we saw. So number one, and we definitely believe it from the Verizon data breach report, and we definitely see it from the Proofpoint data as well. It's increasingly credential phishing. Email is still the number one threat vector, and I think oftentimes we forget that. We're looking at endpoint security, we're trying to find malware on the device, we're implementing AI, machine learning, all of this great stuff, but the reality is, because it works, criminals are still sending office-based macro attacks through email. So really, phishing, credential phishing, threats delivered via the email channel is still your number one threat. And that is still something that we definitely need to address. But actually, increasingly, in terms of the threats that we need to focus on, it's that human-based threat. And this is really what this slide is showing here. This is data over the last year, 2019, and it's threat data. And it's looking at all of the threats that Proofpoint blocked within our customer base. And we actually found that the vast majority of threats were threats targeting people within the business. And what that means is it required somebody to do something. It was human activation. Somebody had to click on the link. Someone had to download the attachment. Someone had to give up the username and password, visit that website, share their credentials with the criminals. Only one threat on this list, this VCE, is a technical vulnerability. It was a technical vulnerability in, it was an office, I believe, where the criminals could leverage that 0-day, they could leverage that vulnerability if it was unpatched and actually gain access to the infrastructure. Only one vulnerability. Everything else required somebody to do something. And in fact, it correlates with data from Microsoft even. They reported that in 2019, they found that malware infections had declined year on year by 67%. Whereas if you look at the URL phishing, that's what all of these spikes are right here. Malicious URLs increased significantly. And I think we have some data from Proofpoint here, where we saw more than 99% increase in URL threats, URL-based threats. So really what this is demonstrating is that, yes, we need to continue to monitor for malware. Yes, we need to continue to protect our devices, endpoints, our infrastructure if we haven't outsourced that infrastructure to the cloud. But actually, the criminals have pivoted already. The criminals have moved away from creating a schematic of our network, and they're actually creating a schematic of our people. They're understanding who's in finance. They understand who our executives are that they want to spoof. They understand who's responsible for payments, for invoices, for processing systems, for engaging with customers, who's in marketing, who's in PR. They understand our businesses in some cases better than we do. And yet we still have this legacy view of network security and device security and microsegmentation and trying to understand all of the assets within our network. And we need to continue to do that. But as we're moving to the cloud, we also need to understand what our critical assets are in terms of people, because that's who the criminals are targeting. And in fact, I want to tell you a story real quick here that really brings this to life. So there was now a customer of Proofpoint, but there was a company that had an incident. They lost some intellectual property. They're a car manufacturer, and they didn't understand how they had this breach. So they came to Proofpoint and said, is this something you can help us out with and prevent in the future? So we actually did some analysis, and we looked at all of the different people within the business and all of the threats that were targeting these people. We also looked on social media, because we have some technology that can look on social media to understand all of the different intel that your people are sharing publicly on social media and what you're sharing on your websites. And we identified just one person. And this was a recent graduate who just joined the business. And he was in the engineering arm of the business. And he very kindly told the criminals that his job was to code all of the key fobs that were responsible for unlocking the cars. So he was part of the team that was responsible for all of the code and all of the design for the key fobs for unlocking cars. The criminals were like, thank you, because now they knew that they needed to target this person with one phishing email pretending to be an Office 365 document, because the company was on Office 365. They sent a phishing email saying, hey, here's the latest project plan. Can you click on this link, read the plan and make sure that you do your bit of the plan. He clicked on the link, gave up his credentials. Then the criminals had access to his Office 365 environment. They had access to all of the data that was on Office 365 in the cloud, all of his code, and they ultimately stole all of that intellectual property. The security team had no idea about this group of people that were responsible for engineering the key fobs. They had no idea. They had no idea to look there to see if they were potentially compromising data. So in that case, the criminals knew the business better than the security and IT teams. And that's why I say, the threat landscape is always changing. It's always evolving. But really what we're seeing is the criminals are moving to people. They're much more targeted. They're doing their research. And as we're moving to the cloud, we're leveraging more cloud applications. We're remote now. We're not accessing the data center. We're using Office 365, Box, Dropbox, whatever application. That's what the criminals are going after. They want our credentials because they want our data and our money.
One more question, Nikki. Can you elaborate on the importance of teaching the employees regarding those risks in a language they can understand? We have policies and trainings program, but still attacks are still impacting the company.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And we're actually going to come onto that topic in a minute because I've got a few slides that talk about training specifically. And in fact, let me move on to that now. So yeah, we have a poll before we talk about some of the recommendations. And the next poll is, what are the biggest challenges in implementing your cybersecurity strategy? Again, is it that lack of awareness, or is it board level executive buy-in? Do you not have that business buy-in right now? Is there a gap in your cybersecurity skills and training? Is it a lack of budget, or do you have no challenges? Let's fill that in, and we're going to come back to those challenges a little later. But yes, specific to training and awareness, let's first start with what we do. How do we protect ourselves against this evolving threat landscape? How do we protect ourselves against credential phishing, against phishing emails, against account compromise, against humans making mistakes? Well, we asked the question in the survey of the CISOs. How much do you expect your cybersecurity budget to increase within the next 2 years? And the good news is we have the money to solve this problem. The money is not the problem. I think the question that people are asking is, what do we do with this money? How do we invest our budget? Where are the areas that we can get the highest return of investment? Because 69% of the CISOs that we surveyed expect cybersecurity budget to increase by more than 11%. 69% expect a more than 11% increase. That's huge, huge. We've got 18% that are expecting an increase by more than 21%. So the budget isn't an issue. I think the question is, what do we do with it? How do we invest it? And one of the things that we say is critical in your cybersecurity strategy, one of the things that we have to do before we can think about implementing technology or the latest and greatest solution is we have to understand our business. As I mentioned earlier, the criminals are doing this work. They're not doing it for us, they're doing it for themselves. They're understanding our businesses, and we need to get the same view. We need to know who's under attack. Who are the people within our business that are targeted with credential phishing? Because it's not everybody. Not everybody has that same threat landscape. So who's under attack? The next is, who's vulnerable? Who keeps clicking on that link? Who keeps compromising their credentials? Who keeps falling for the fake phishing emails? Who's vulnerable? Who exposes that business to risk because of their behavior? And then finally, who's privileged? And when we say privilege, what data do they have access to? What systems do they have access to? What ability do they have? And does that ability, again, potentially expose the business to risk? We have to know who our VAPs are. We have to know who the very attacked people are based on their vulnerability, their attack profile, and their privilege, what they have access to within the business. Because based on this visibility and this intelligence into our people, we can then build a security strategy that's specific to each individual, that's specific to each role. Because we know that, for example, we did this analysis for some companies and we found that HR typically get malware-based attacks. Right? Their job is to open CVs. Their job is to open those Word documents. Their job is to interact with every single attachment that comes into the organization because it's somebody applying for a job. They need to read those CVs. And so based on that insight, we know that we need to create something special for HR. Maybe you want to sandbox all of those attachments. You know, make sure it's not malicious before it gets delivered. Or maybe you want to allow them to open the attachment, but in an isolated environment. So you can read the CV, but you're not downloading any of that malware from the document, right? You build your strategy based on the visibility. On the other hand, we know that PR professionals, those that are working with media, they're working with investors, they're working in communications. Again, their job is to send a lot of data. They have high privilege. They have access to confidential company data before it's released to the press. They have access to financial information in some cases before it's released to investors. So again, we need to create special controls for them. Maybe you want to implement data loss prevention solutions, or maybe you want to train them that, hey, because you're so privileged, you need to have special training about how you access and work with this data. Right. And really that speaks to what we do. Once you get that visibility, what do you do? How do you protect your business? And the first thing you need to do is protect across those key people-centric threat vectors. Email is the #1 threat vector. Why? Because that's how you get access to people. That's how the criminals get access to individuals. And it still works. So we must protect email before we think about anything else. Because it's ultimately a threat starting with an email that then leads to malware on the endpoint. But we're always responding. We're focused on endpoint security without going back and blocking as much as possible from reaching the endpoint or the user in the first place. Then we need to make our users resilient. And again, I'll touch on what that means. And then finally, we need to protect the data itself, protect the data that they're working with, protect the access to that data. All right, so our final poll, and I know I had a poll question earlier, we'll touch on that, the results in a minute, but our final poll, on average, how often do you train your employees on cybersecurity awareness? Are you training them ongoing? Is it, 3 to 4 times a year, so once a quarter? Is it once every 6 months? Is it once a year? Or have you never trained your employees on security before? How often are you all running those training programs? Because according to the data, according to that survey that we ran, there is some inconsistency between the UAE and the rest of the world. According to the survey results, where we asked the same question, 75% of the CISOs that we surveyed have trained employees as little as twice a year. That's it, twice a year or less. 75% of organizations out there are training employees twice a year or less. Now, we did another survey, a global survey this time, specific to training and awareness. And we asked, again, the security professionals across the world how often they train their employees. And we found almost the opposite result. 84% of global security professionals are training their employees at least once a quarter. So that's at least once every 3 months. Some are doing it monthly, some are doing it regularly. Some are doing it as people make mistakes. You must go to training. But they're doing it at least once a quarter, where in the UAE, we're only doing it twice a year. So there's some inconsistency here. We're not focused on training our employees. We're not focused on raising awareness. We're too focused on technical controls and not spending enough time on the people that are actually getting targeted. We're not letting them know that the criminals are increasingly targeting them and that they're exposing us to risk. And that's why at the beginning of this discussion, I said, we actually have a lot of work to do. And how can we train them? What can we do? Well, first of all, we can identify again, who's being targeted. Who are those people that keep falling for it? Who are those people that keep compromising themselves? Who are those people that keep clicking on phishing links? And we can do that by sending fake phishing emails, right? Send fake phishing emails to all of your employees, see who clicks, and then you understand who's potentially got risky behavior. Once you identify who's got risky behavior, what you need to do then is not only raise awareness, but importantly, you want to change their risky behavior, right? Because there's a difference between awareness and behavior change. Most people are super aware that smoking is bad and it's going to give you cancer, but there's still a lot of people that still smoke even though they're aware. So there's a difference between awareness and behavior change. And the way we change behavior is by making it easy. We make it digestible. Anytime someone makes a mistake, we send them to training. And that training isn't for 1 hour, it's not for 5 hours, it's maybe 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and it's regular. Anytime they make a mistake, you send them to training. Anytime they make a mistake, you prompt them and you alert them to what they've potentially done wrong. And then finally, you want to reduce that exposure, because the other way that you change behavior is by bringing people into your security fold, by making them part of the solution. And an example of a way that you can do that is, a simple button in the Outlook, for example. So if someone sees an email that they're not sure about, it looks like it's a phishing email, all the person has to do is press that button. It automatically sends the email to security or the SOC team, and that SOC team can analyze it, or you can use your email sandbox to determine if it's good or bad. But again, it's about communication, because if you find that it is bad, you need to tell the employee, hey, you were right. This is a bad email. Thank you. And that way you're embedding people in your security program. And the question about the language that we use in our training programs, it needs to be the language that they understand. And that's why we need to work with our different business partners. So for HR example, we know that their job is to open emails and open CVs. So if your training program says don't open attachments, you've automatically turned off the HR team. It's not relevant to them because they have to open the attachments. So you have to make it specific to their job role. You have to speak their language. You have to make it easy. You have to make it digestible. You have to make it short, and you have to make it regular. That's the only way we're going to change behavior.
Nikki, we have a question. Why do you feel companies are not training their employees as often?
I think, again, it's because of the type of training that we do. What we typically see here at Proofpoint, before companies obviously leverage our solutions, is they'll do annual security training, right? Because HR might says, hey, security, you've got 1 hour during our new employee onboarding, and in that hour, you can do your training. And so security is trying to cram as much as possible in the 1 hour during onboarding and, just talk about all of the different elements of security, all of the different policies. And look, honestly, none of us are paying attention to policy documents if it's super complex and we're hearing about policy for 1 hour, right? We need to break it down. And I think right now what's happening is that we're doing once a year, half day, big, intense training, and then we're forgetting about it. And we know that that doesn't work. It's just like driving. Imagine if you do a crash course in driving and you've never driven before, and you do 1 week of driving intense just for the year, and then you try to take a test and you try to go on the road, right? You're not going to be successful. Versus if you do regular training, regular practice, you make a mistake, your coach tells you, hey, that was a mistake. This is how you do it. It's ongoing. Also, you forget to put your seatbelt on, you get a fine, right? So there's that immediate feedback. That's what we need to do with security.
The next question related to the same topic. Why is it so less in UAE and Middle East and Africa region compared to other regions? Is there a lack of education locally? I don't think it's a lack of education.
I don't think it's a lack of education locally. Look, at the end of the day, I also think it's the type of access that Middle Eastern companies have access to training solutions, right? I mean, at Proofpoint, we have capabilities and solutions that are in local language. Again, it's in names that are familiar. It's in different roles that are familiar to the region. It's customized to the region. Because as I said, it has to be customized to the job. It has to be customized to the region. It has to be relevant to the individuals. And I think it's only recently that we started seeing a lot of that customization for the Middle Eastern region. In the past, it's very much been, US names and US themes and US heavy. And so it's not been relevant to your region. And, a lot of UAE CISOs and security professionals have had to create their own security training programs from scratch because they had nothing to use, right? They had nothing to leverage. But I think now with where we are in technology, we can start to embed technology to automate our training. We can start to embed technology so that if somebody clicks on a phishing link and it's a fake phishing link, you automatically send them to training. It's customized, it's in local language, it's short, it's easy, and that way you're automating the program. But in the past, all we did was, create policy documents and try to educate people on those policies. So I'm aware of the time. I'm just going to cover up the next couple of slides. So this is really the conclusion here where, it's looking at Proofpoint and our capabilities. And a lot of what I mentioned during this discussion is really what Proofpoint provides. So we protect people from the threats that are targeting them via the email channel, via cloud applications, via the web. We provide isolation solutions so that your people can continue to click on those links, but they're not giving up their credentials. They're not downloading malware. It's in an isolated environment. We also provide training programs and training solutions. Again, they are customized, they're localized. You can change different names, different topics, specific to your organization. You can send simulated phishing attacks based on the real phishing emails that you've blocked targeting your business. And then in addition, we have solutions that protect the data itself, you know, DLP solutions, solutions that also monitor for insiders that make mistakes, right? What are they trying to do with that data? Where is it going? Are they trying to upload it to Dropbox? Is that against policy? We can implement those policies and controls within the insider threat management solution and prevent your users from making mistakes. And then finally, how do we protect or prepare for the future? 31% of the CISOs that we surveyed cite a lack of board level buy-in as a major obstacle. So earlier, we asked that poll question of what's the biggest challenge that you face in your organization of implementing security. You all actually said a gap in cybersecurity skills and training. You mentioned this third one here. And I think that's true. I mean, 23% of the CISOs agree with you. And that's really the fact that we're stretched. We don't have enough skills and capabilities within the security team. You know, we have to leverage managed service providers that don't really understand our business. There's that lack of skill within the security team. And this is why we have to automate. This is why we have to implement technology that can block the vast majority of those threats that are being delivered via email, so that you can focus on those high incident, high priority incidents and alerts. We have to automate our training so that we can focus on the 5% of people that keep falling for the simulated phishing attacks. We have to focus on visibility and understanding which people within our business are under attack. Who are those VAPs? So that we can communicate that to the business and speak their language, which is ultimately about people, revenue, finance, bottom line. The business does not care about how much malware you blocked. They don't care about how much spam you blocked. What they do care about is that HR is under attack and they can't do their job. And this is what we need to do to protect the HR team. What they do care about is that these business email compromise attacks are making us lose money because our finance team is wiring money to the criminal. And here's what security is going to do about it. That's what they care about. We need to start speaking the business language, and that's how we can solve for the threats that are increasingly targeting our people. All right, so with that, this is our final slide here. The survey results of the full study are available online. You can download them from the link above. There's a lot more information, a lot more detail, a lot more intel, so please definitely download that. In addition, we're offering a free assessment to everyone on this call to understand the vulnerability of your people. So we can create simulated phishing attacks. We can send it out to all of your users, or you can, and we can determine how many people click on those phishing emails and then ultimately send those people to training. So if you're interested in that free assessment, definitely do copy that link. We'll put the link in the chat as well. And yeah, let's open it up to any more questions.
So now that thank you so much, Nikki. That was really, really insightful. And I think that car company example that you gave stuck with me. It's quite incredible how something that small can cause a breach that can cost businesses huge amounts of money. And it's probably going to be very difficult for companies to even, you know, zero in on like a situation like that. You don't expect something like that, so to speak, almost. The floor is open for questions. Like we mentioned earlier, if you have something that you would like to ask Emile or Nikki directly, just raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can ask the question directly. But one question I had, Nikki, was how does it look looking into the future? How is the landscape right now? So do we expect humans to remain the center of attacks going forward, or will the threat landscape completely change again as we see more automation, more technologies coming in?
Yeah, I guess, Emile, it'd be great to get your thoughts as well on what you're seeing in your region. Certainly globally, what we're seeing is that the threat landscape is always evolving, right? Like Microsoft said, for example, in 2019, malware was down year on year, 67%. Whereas at the beginning of 2019, everyone was talking about ransomware. You know, 2018, beginning of 2019 was ransomware. It was all about malware. But now we're finding that malware is actually going down, and what the criminals want to steal are those credentials. Right? So it's risky to build your security program based off of, you know, what's happening today or what happened tomorrow in terms of the tactics that the criminals are using. And that's why we recommend that actually what you should do is understand what your company profile looks like. Who are the people that are being targeted in your company? What are they targeted with? And then building a strategy that protects your business, because every business is different.
One more question, Nikki. Do attackers need some sort of logistic from people within the organization to make the attack effective? You've provided good examples on how to prevent this.
What, run that by me again, sorry.
Do attackers need some sort of logistics from people within the organization to make the attack effective? You have provided good examples, but how to prevent this?
Yeah, so they actually don't need that much infrastructure or logistics from people. In fact, in terms of human error, we found that 22% of breaches were because people make mistakes. You also have malicious insiders. So those are users or employees within the business that might work with criminal elements to steal data and, you know, give it to some malicious company. That's actually a very tiny percent of malicious insiders or of insider threats. The vast majority of people just making mistakes.
Correct. But talking about the attackers from outside, Nikki, I think as per the previous study that we've done, 93% of the attacks do rely on an internal employee to activate them. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's right. So again, it's not somebody that's maliciously trying to compromise themselves or their business. They're making a mistake. But it does require the person to activate it, to interact with it, to click on a link, to download an attachment, to enable the macro, right? Somebody has to do something to ultimately compromise themselves or the business or their credentials. And that's why we say, look, it's important to first of all protect email, because over 90% of those threats are being delivered via the email channel. Right? So what you can do is implement email sandbox. You can implement things like email authentication as well. DMARC, I don't know what the adoption of DMARC is like in the region, but it's an email authentication standard that prevents criminals from spoofing your identity to trick your people. So in the case of Proofpoint, you can implement DMARC so that nobody can use the email address acosgrove@proofpoint.com to trick Emile. Right? There are a lot of controls that you can implement to block these attacks from reaching your people. But fundamentally, I do believe that even though we're blocking these things, we need to tell people what we're blocking, because they don't know that they're under attack. And that's why they keep clicking on it. So if you see an email that's pretending to be Office 365, you should actually use that email in your training program. Send it to the people that were actually targeted. See if they would have clicked. And if they do click on that simulated phishing email, say, hey, this email was actually real. We blocked it. You clicked on it. And so you need to be aware that these are the types of things that are coming to your inbox. That's the only way we're going to change behavior.
I think even with the COVID situation, sorry, Emile, but Nikki, just on your
related to IoT.
I'm sorry, Emile?
You shed some lights on botnet related to IoT. That's another.
Oh my gosh. So this is an interesting topic. It's not one that we've really researched too much in Proofpoint, because what we're finding is, again, actually the criminals aren't so much compromising Internet of Things and those connected devices. I think, again, there was a lot of, this is the risk. We need to make sure that we're not building our security programs based off of media and what's in the press, right? Because there was a lot of press and a lot of communications about these connected devices, about connected cameras in our offices, you know, connected video conferencing, and that the criminals are hacking to all of these devices and getting access to our data. Well, first of all, we're not in the office right now, so the criminals aren't really trying to hack any of that. I think you need to be concerned about connected devices if you're critical infrastructure. So in the case of here in London, you've got the underground, the tube, the underground train system, and that's increasingly becoming connected to the internet, and that's critical infrastructure. And when criminals, or if criminals potentially get access to that, they can really cause damage. And that's what we need to be concerned about. If you've got a pipeline that's, you know, providing gas or providing oil to citizens and to cities, then you need to be concerned about Internet of Things and connected devices, right? Because all of that could cause major disruption to the business. But I think for the average organization that has a camera or webcam or things like that, really we're not seeing that threat take foot so far. But actually, in terms of botnets, what we are seeing is criminals using employee devices to be part of those botnets to send out even more phishing, whether internally to more employees or externally to third parties. That's what we need to monitor for.
One more question, Nikki, that's just come up from Hussam Alabed is DMARC. It's true they can't spoof an email from Proofpoint, but they can register a domain name closer to yours with, you know, 1 instead of I, and then it will work. Agree, he's asked. Is that true?
It will be less likely to work because, okay, I get my phone, I see an email, it's from Emile. Emile's important at Proofpoint. It's Emile@proofpoint.com. I am much more likely to respond to that because it's exactly his email address. So there's no way for me to know that this is a phishing email. But if I see Emile and it's a Proofpoint with a 0 or Proofpoint with a 1, my brain subconsciously is much more likely to look at that and think maybe something's wrong. So what we want to do is we want to push criminals to the less credible identity spoofing. We want to move them away from actually using our identities, which we should be protecting. Actually push them to using less credible. And you know why this is important? More and more financial organizations are actually stating in their implementing policy that says, we will not process your invoice and we will not respond to your email if you don't have DMARC implemented. Because you're asking us to pay an invoice, we can't validate that this email really came from you. We can't validate that this invoice really came from you. And as such, we're not going to pay it because it's going to impact our bottom line.
Right.
So I think we're going to see more companies actually put policy in place that says we will not pay any invoices and we will not interact with any business emails that haven't implemented DMARC. And I think increasingly it's going to be critical for all companies to implement DMARC.
One more thing I want to add, Nikki, here. With the Proofpoint email fraud defense, we can provide you visibility on lookalike domains. So with the example, we can provide the customer and we can inform them that there is a new domain that has been registered, for example, with the 1 instead of the I or with the 0 instead of the O, and then you will know about it.
So you will have visibility even before the organization does, and you can give them a heads up almost, so to speak.
Yes, if they are a Proofpoint customer and they have the Proofpoint email fraud defense solution, yes, we can give them that visibility and we can help them to put that domain down, to take the domain down.
I think we're almost out of time. There's one question here. As companies adopt new AI tech, can phishing emails or attacks be made on AI or IoT devices? If so, how are we protected? That's one. And just a very short point, Nikki. I saw in your email you'd highlighted an example of an email with coronavirus. I think that's become a major problem because we've seen a lot of emails going around with COVID-19, you know, almost leveraging on that COVID to increase attacks. So how do you think companies can deal with that issue right now?
Yeah, so I mean, we've definitely seen that as well within our threat data, where the criminals over the last 3 months have almost 100% pivoted to coronavirus-based phishing emails, almost 100% pivot. And that 100%. That's because it works. Again, why would you hack the network? Why would you try and implement some sophisticated cyber attack when you can send a phishing email that says, here's the list of all of the employees in the company that have coronavirus. Click on this link so that you can see the list and protect yourself. I mean, almost everybody in a company would fall for that. Like, oh my gosh, my colleague has coronavirus. I want to protect myself. I want to know. And that's what the criminals are tapping into, that fear. They're tapping into that uncertainty. They're tapping into human curiosity as well, because there's really no need to click on that link. We're all at home, but we're curious, right?
Yeah. So
and that's what the criminals are expecting, that you're going to click on it and install malware or give up your credentials because you want access to that information. So we've seen a almost 100% pivot to coronavirus-based attacks, where again, they're spoofing identities. The World Health Organization doesn't have DMARC. And we've seen phishing emails coming from the World Health Organization's domains to trick people. And this is why it's critical to implement email security controls that can block all of that, that can prevent all of that, that can ultimately protect your people.
Brilliant. And the question of AI. Sorry.
One more question, Nikki. Looking ahead, many companies may switch to some form of remote working. Any pointers to help them ensure increased protection?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in fact, a lot of organizations are already switched to remote working. And I think at the beginning of this crisis and the disruption, really what we're trying to do was provide access, right? We're trying to leverage, new types of access management. We're trying to implement VPNs to our organizations and our users. We're trying to get new laptops rolled out to all of our employees so that people could work from home. Whereas now, really what organizations need to focus on is protection, because our users are doing personal activities on their work device. So their personal activities is exposing the business to threats on the device. So really what we're saying is you need to make sure that you're protecting the user based on the personal and private activities on the device. So some of that might be, making sure that they have isolated webmail, so that they can do their Gmail, they can do their Yahoo, they can visit their personal websites on their laptop, but it's in an isolated environment, so that all of the activities that they perform does not impact the security posture of the device. So you want browser isolation, you want email isolation solutions. You also want to continue to monitor for phishing, because if anything, as I mentioned, phishing emails are increasing. Leveraging coronavirus, we're all communicating via email. We're all using Teams. We're all communicating with our employees and with our colleagues. And so the volume of email is increasing, which means people are less likely to think before they click on something. They just want to quickly respond and interact. So we need to double down on email security and make sure we're blocking all of these threats from reaching our people.
I think we're almost out of time. There's one last question. It says again about IoT, and also there's a question on 5G. What kind of an impact will 5G have on cybercrime? So maybe with IoT and 5G, if you want to just take that on, Nikki, and then we'll. Yeah,
I think we can certainly follow up with that. I'm not the expert in those topics, so let's definitely follow up. We've got access to the questions, and we can make sure that we've got an expert that can respond to those questions.
Brilliant. And before, to everyone attending here, before we sign off and say bye-bye, we have one final poll question. I think Nikki's made it very clear during her presentation how it's crucial for organization to understand that people are at the heart of this, and we need to address that. The question we have, if we can bring that on, yes. Would you like to discuss a very attacked person risk assessment for your organization? I think you can answer yes, no, not sure. And this is just for us to understand where we are at right now. But yeah, it was a very interesting discussion, Nikki, and I think it highlighted a lot. I think for the mindset has been, the perception has been in the market that it's external rather than internal. And now that's changing. You're right, that's changing. But from a CSO perspective to an employer and employee perspective, and now it has to reach boardrooms, I think that's crucial that we understand this aspect and address it. Thank you so much to everyone, to our panelists, to our attendees for taking the time out today. Any other questions you have, please feel free to send it across and we'll pass it on to the experts, get your responses on those. We hope you enjoyed the session, found it beneficial. We'll have the entire webinar live on the website, so you can go back to it. You can also access the survey, the results, and all of that. Please follow Gulf Business on all our social platforms. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you once again, Nikki and Emile, for your time. And hope all of you found this session beneficial. Yeah, please just ensure that you answer the poll. And then, yeah, I'll leave. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Arti.